with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're so thrilled to have you here for our ongoing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for about a year now. We've done over 130 of these author virtual events in that time. And it's been a really wonderful way to stay connected with our audience, to meet new people, to connect with new audiences, even reach people outside of our city, our state, and occasionally outside of the country. So thank you for joining us tonight. We have a lot of stuff coming up this spring. I would say there are at least 2 or 3 weeks in the next month or two where we have 4 or 5 author events in a given week, and they're all over the map. So whatever you're interested in, I'm sure we'll have something to suit you, and maybe some things that you didn't even know you were interested in as well. So I would encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see the full list of things. We'll put a link here in the chat as well, so you can do that. But I will make note of the fact that coming up at the end of May, early June, we're going to be doing a lot of programming around the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So that includes everything from a conversation with Don Lemon from CNN for his wonderful new book called This is the Fire, a book about the Second Amendment and its relationship to racial justice by a woman named Carol Anderson. We're going to be doing a program with a novelist named Jewel Parker Rhodes, who wrote a novel called Magic City, which is the book from which we got our name back in the late 90s, which was the first novel I had ever read that dealt with the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's being reprinted this year. And also an event with Scott Ellsworth, who wrote one of the seminal texts about that called Death in a Promised Land back decades ago. And he's got a new book coming out, kind of looking at what has happened in the last couple of decades as this has become rightly much more known around the world and been dealt with. So I would encourage you to look at that list of programming. Really excited about tonight's event. I want to say first off, big thank you to our friends at All Souls Unitarian Church, a partnership we've had ongoing for many, many years. And when we were doing in-person events, it was one of our favorite venues in town to do things. Gosh, we had everybody from Salman Rushdie to Elizabeth Gilbert, everybody in between there at All Souls. And this, if we were doing it in person, would be another event we'd be really thrilled to have there. But thanks to this digital technology that we have, we can do this still. So thank you to All Souls, and especially thanks to LaDonna Boyd, who's one of our community partners that we work with a lot on these programs. Tonight, we have a guest moderator, which is always a thrill to me because I get to sit back and be an audience member and enjoy this. And also, to be honest with you, I do about a zillion of these a year, so it gives me a little sense of a break. But couldn't be more thrilled to have our guest moderator tonight, who is former Mayor Kathy Taylor. I've known Kathy for a long time, and Kathy has always been a big supporter of what we've been doing, even early on, pre-Magic City Books. And we had Magic Book Smart Tulsa events, which was our kind of first iteration. We would occasionally do events at Kathy's house. We did events with, New York, a lot of food things. Kathy's quite the foodie, so we would do a lot of food things. We did a kind of early Pioneer Woman event there. We did something with the New York Times there. It was a lot of fun. We need to get back to that at some point, but couldn't be more thrilled. And Kathy is going to tell you a little bit of a personal connection that she has to our subject matter tonight, which I think will be a really special opportunity. So thank you, Kathy, for being with us tonight. But the reason for the season is we are here to talk about a really wonderful new book called Justice, Justice Thou Shalt Pursue, which is a collaboration and a book by the late, certainly great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we lost less than a year ago, and has had, I don't think it's, I don't need to tell you about the impact that she's had on American culture and our world. And so when I had a chance to come across this book and see that it was written with Amanda Taylor, a law professor at Berkeley, I thought, what are the chances? Could we get this to happen? Could we email someone? How do we get the wheels in motion to pull this thing off? And I was so thrilled to get connected with Professor Taylor and make this event happen. And one thing that I was really excited about is we'll hear a little bit about, maybe you all know some of this, about the time that Justice Ginsburg spent here in Oklahoma for a couple of years. She even had a child here in Oklahoma, and it was a pretty pivotal moment in her life. So we'll hear a bit about that. You're going to have a lot of questions, I would assume, and we would encourage you to put those into the Q&A, and Mayor Taylor will be pulling some of those while we go. And most importantly, we want you to buy a copy or 2 or 3 of this book, because we want to have this book on the Oklahoma bestsellers list next week. When that comes out, you can help us make that happen. It's a great book for people in your life that are interested in not just the notorious RBG, but issues of justice and how you can, on a human level, not having the levers of power, but make a difference in the community that you live in. If that's something of interest to you, I would encourage you to get this book. So without any further ado, I want to say once again, thank you to Mayor Taylor for moderating with us tonight, and a huge thank you and welcome to Professor Amanda Tyler, and a congratulations on this book. And I will now turn it over to Kathy Taylor to take it from here.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for all that you do to bring these great dialogues to Tulsa. This is definitely a must-read book. It is captivating. Professor Tyler, I know you said to call you Amanda, so I will. Amanda, I really felt like her voice was speaking to me as I read the dialogue that you had with her. And I know this was such an important collaboration. You said that you framed the book as a window into how the justice thought of her legacy and how she wanted to be remembered. So can you describe for us her vision for her legacy?
How long have you got?
An hour.
Exactly right. Let me just say it off the top, what a privilege it was to work with her on this. I had served as her law clerk in the year 1999 to 2000, the term that spanned that year. And I got to work with her again closely 20 years later. And it was such an honor and such a privilege and such a joy. And what made it special, among so many things, was that we were talking about compiling this book and offering it as a window into her life. And it builds around an interview that I did of her that is the anchor of the book, but also then lays out materials that give you a window into her time as an advocate for gender equality, her time as a justice, and what she thought about and held so dear in terms of her values. And then also we've included some of her final speeches, which, as you say, throughout the book, let her tell her story in her own words. And I think what comes across more than anything is what we try to preserve and convey in the book's title, which is that the pursuit of justice, born out of the pages of Deuteronomy, the passage, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue, comes from Deuteronomy, that her faith, her upbringing, her feeling that she was called to service, all of those things were central to who she was. And in addition, she loved this country and she loved our Constitution. And the more perfect union, that comes from the preamble of the Constitution, which says that we are making this Constitution and forming this government and establishing this country to build a more perfect union. And when you read about her and you read her opinions and you read her talking about the country, what comes across more than anything else is that she believed it was up to all of us to do the work of making and building that more perfect union, that it wasn't just up to the justices on the Supreme Court. It was an obligation, really, that all of us have as Americans. And you also get a really deep dive into how she did that work and what she thought that work entailed. And more than anything else, I think she believed that the Constitution was supposed to be a force for opening up opportunities for everyone to live up to their full human potential, a phrase she liked to use, or to borrow a phrase from her dissent in Shelby County, to strive to achieve full citizenship on equal stature for everyone. And her jurisprudence throughout, I think, reflects those values.
It's hard to say groundbreaking without thinking of every impact she made in her life. But as Jeff said, she spent 2 years in Fort Sill with her husband when he was on Army duty, and that's when she had her first child. She then went to law school at Harvard with a 14-month-old, which at the time, I think 1956, was groundbreaking. And she faced many challenges in that first very groundbreaking era of her life. And you said that she faced those with ingenuity and determination. How did she balance those types of things? And you talk about it so well in the book.
It's really quite remarkable to think about, and I think about this from my vantage as someone decades her junior, who, I look at the world and I see all these things that we can do to make it easier for women to enter the legal profession, for women in the workforce. And yet I have to take into account that all of the things that have been accomplished between her coming up as a young lawyer and my own experience, and it's just a sea change in terms of progress. She had no support, no infrastructure on which to rely in going to law school. She, I hope we'll talk more about Oklahoma, because I think that those were really important years in her life. But as you say, she then goes to law school. She has a toddler. She's one of 9 women in a class of over 500 at Harvard Law School, where the stories, and if you don't, you can just assume correctly that it was really hard to be a woman in that environment. Her husband is a year ahead of her. He gets sick with cancer during their time. It's not at all clear he will survive. It's very serious. And somehow through all of that, she manages to rise to the top of her class, serve on the Harvard Law Review. When they move to New York and she transfers for her final year to Columbia, serve on that law review, and graduate tied for first in her class. She is superhuman. You use the word groundbreaking. I'm going to use the word that she, I think, invented, path marking. She loved the word path marking. That's her in a nutshell. She just kept persevering. And I think, to connect it back to Oklahoma and other parts of her life, it was a product of the fact that even before going to law school, she had experienced severe adversity. She had experienced extensive discrimination, both as a woman and as a Jewish person. And in Oklahoma, she had her daughter. Well, when her employer, the government, found out that she was pregnant, she was demoted. So she had all of these different experiences, and yet she just kept propelling herself forward. And I think that is a big part of the explanation for how she was able to accomplish so much, because as she explains in the book, particularly after getting through the period when Marty battled cancer, she just sort of decided, no matter what is thrown in my way, I'm going to keep moving forward. And I think that's the story of her life, because then famously she graduates from law school, top of her class, and no job offers. So what does she do? She leans on a mentor who helps her land a clerkship where she does marvelous work, and he helps her get into the academic world. And she just keeps excelling despite having all these various hardships put in her place, put in her way. And again, I think that's how she's able eventually to rise all the way to the top and sit on the Supreme Court.
I think the theme that runs through the book, and her words and yours, is she looked at challenges as opportunities. Because when I heard this story, when I read the story of her going to Rutgers, and when they had pay cuts, she got the most substantial pay cut and was told she was being paid less than her male professors because she had a husband who had a good paying job, and so she didn't need the money. And she didn't seem to react to that with anger. She seemed to react to it with, well, there's work to be done here. Is that how you viewed her?
I love that. I love how you phrase that setbacks weren't something to complain about and sort of, get angry over. They were opportunities. And that is a perfect story to encapsulate that, because what happened, as you say, she's hired there the same year the Equal Pay Act becomes law, and yet she's paid less than her male counterparts. So what does she do? She helps organize all the women at Rutgers to complain about this. And eventually a huge settlement is reached whereby they all receive a bunch of back pay. So it's not, let's sit around and complain. It's, what can I do about it? What can I do to make this better? And every stage of her life, you see that. I mentioned that she was the victim of pregnancy discrimination. So she knew firsthand about that. Well, that's another one of the first projects she delved into when she started fighting for gender equality, representing teachers who, when they would get pregnant, would be summarily fired. And she said, this is not a disability. They can teach right up until they have their babies. And if they want to come back, they should be able to come back. And so it was through each of these experiences in her life that she turned them, as you say, into opportunities to try and build a better America as she saw it.
I love the story of the very first case, the case really that Marty, her husband and life partner, showed to her, because it really shows that she cared about discrimination and allowing all people to fulfill their potential, men and women, and that men were as disadvantaged by gender roles as women. So that story, tell us a little bit about that story of that very first case that she made landmark decision in.
What's so great about this case is that there's the story of her and Marty that's at the heart of it, and then there's the case itself, and each is in its own right a great story. And for those of you for whom the story will ring familiar, you may have seen the movie On the Basis of Sex, which is a movie made about their work together on this case. And it's important to note that movie was written by Justice Ginsburg's nephew, and he said he chose that case rather than one of her Supreme Court cases because it was also a story about their marriage. So what was the Moritz case? It was a case that involved a man named Charles Moritz who wanted to take care of his mother, but also work. And so he had to hire a caregiver to help him take care of his mother. He was a dutiful son, as Justice Ginsburg liked to say. Then he wanted to put in for a caregiver tax deduction. So this is a tax case. That's how it comes across Marty's desk. Now, the story is Mr. Moritz had never married, and the tax code excluded only never married men from the opportunity to claim this deduction. So a woman who had never married could have claimed the deduction. And he complained about this. He filed a brief in the tax court where he said, were I a dutiful daughter, I would get this deduction. I'm a son. I don't. This makes no sense. That's it. That was the sum total of his brief. Marty Ginsburg, some years later, said it was the best legal brief he ever read. And I think it was short and to the point, which a lot of briefs are not. For those in the audience who are lawyers, you're surely nodding in agreement. The case came to their attention because Marty used to read the tax court notes that would come out of the tax court summarizing cases. And he saw this case and he walked into the other room and handed the notes to Justice Ginsburg and said, you need to read these. And as he later told the story, she said, I don't read tax cases. That's what you do. He was a great tax lawyer. And he said, read this one. And within minutes, as he told the story years later, she came in the other room and said, let's take it. And so they called Mr. Moritz up and said, we want to represent you pro bono for free. We think this is a great case. And they briefed it and they argued it together. They split the oral argument. And a couple of things about that. The brief, it winds up being the very first brief that she's written and filed in a gender discrimination case, never before published. We have that in the book. And I think that's a really special window into how she was thinking at the outset of this campaign. She was going to frame it and how she was going to argue that gender should be treated like race. It is a suspect class in her view, and any law that classifies on the basis of gender should receive the highest scrutiny. Now, in the movie, when they argue the argument, they split the argument, and that is in fact what happened. Marty gets up and argues in the movie, and then she gets up and she stumbles. And I remember I asked her, and I talk about this in the introduction to the book, did that actually happen? Because she is someone who was always the most prepared person in the room, always impeccably ready for anything that came her way. And so I did not believe that she paused. And I remember she said to me, well, of course I didn't pause. I hit the ground running. But they wanted to add that for dramatic effect, Amanda, she said. So that's what they did. But that case winds up being enormously important in the 1970s because they win in the appellate court. They win in the 10th Circuit, one of the courts right below the Supreme Court. And the government seeks review in the Supreme Court, but meanwhile, the law has changed. So there's no real reason for the Supreme Court to take the case, but something really important happens. This is way before personal computers and data mining and all of that. The Solicitor General for the United States has the Department of Defense make a list using what technology they have of every single law in the United States Code that distinguishes between men and women. And they attach that to their brief to the Supreme Court to say, hey, this case is really important because all these other laws are in the balance. And what Justice Ginsburg did, and she talks about this in the book, is she takes that list and she says, all right, here are our marching orders. We've got to go after these laws one by one. And that's what she does in the 1970s.
So in the book, she gives a lot of credit in her life to others. She's very humble and generous to Professor Gunther for the federal internship, for Marty even for the Supreme Court, for lobbying for the Supreme Court, to the women who came before her. I wonder, with that kind of humility, how she felt about becoming the notorious RBG. She's on my face mask, she's on my wall, she's on my computer stickers. How did that impact her?
It's interesting because when I think about Justice Ginsburg, and I think all of her law clerks would say this, I think about someone without an ego. She did not need to be the center of attention. She did not seek out the limelight. It was, for her, it was about the work. She wanted to do the work, and she loved this country, and she wanted to do what she could to use her talents to make it a better, more just society. And so when the Notorious RBG comes along, it's really quite surprising, because those of us in particular who clerked for her before she became the Notorious RBG, we were quite floored by this, because again, she's someone who didn't seek out the limelight. There would be events at the Supreme Court and you would find her sort of off in the corner. She was reserved. And so this was a surprise. And I think what she came to like about it was that she felt and believed, and I think this is the best version of thinking about the Notorious RBG, that it was about the ideas, and it was about what she stood for and what she fought for. It wasn't about her per se. And that's why I think she came to embrace it, because yes, you're absolutely right. I think one of her finest qualities was that she liked to lift up the voices of others. She liked to honor those who paved the way before her. And so it wasn't about her. But the Notorious RBG got the message out to a broad audience of Americans, and especially younger, next generation Americans, that if you see injustice, call it out. And if you believe in something, fight for it. And if you think there's a way to make things better, you should do that work. And that she very much embraced. Again, it was about the ideas, and it was about the principles for which she stood. And I think it made her very happy that through this idea, this moniker of the Notorious RBG, more people were talking about that work and how important it was.
So it's interesting that one of her best friends on the court was Justice Scalia, because obviously I don't know how many opinions they signed on together, but I know that they were very much ideologically on different sides, but they each speak very fondly of the other. I have to imagine that her demeanor, her openness in that regard impacted the whole demeanor of the court when she served. Did you observe that as a clerk?
Absolutely. I think back, I was talking with some of my students about this yesterday. The year that I clerked was the year before Bush versus Gore. That group of justices had sat together for a very long time at that point, and went on to sit together for many years. And they had a really nice collegial atmosphere, and it trickled down to the clerks. All the clerks got along very nicely. And I think it was set, a lot of that tone was set by her relationship with Justice Scalia. Also, her relationship with Chief Justice Rehnquist, who she liked very much. She called him my chief, which I think he quite liked. But her relationship with Justice Scalia was really, it was something that made quite an influence on myself and many others, because as you say, they disagreed a lot. They disagreed on a very fundamental level about how to interpret the Constitution. And what that meant was that in a very substantial number of cases, they were on the other side. Virtually every 5-4 decision I can think of, save one or two the year I clerked, and we're talking about over 20 5-4 constitutional law decisions, they were on the opposite sides of one another. But what I think was really important to keep in mind and to learn from and reflect upon with respect to their relationship was, one, as they like to say, it was built on a lot of common ground. So they both loved their families. They both loved food and wine. They both loved the opera. They both came from New York. He was from Queens. She was from Brooklyn. But I think the larger point is that they both believed in the good faith of each other. They both believed that the other loved this country and that they were trying to do what they thought was the right thing. And that presumption of good faith enabled them to disagree. And I should underscore, disagree vehemently on a lot of issues. It was also the case that, and she talked about this at Justice Scalia's memorial service. And I should say, I wish that in retrospect that we had included her remarks at that memorial service in the book, because they're really special. She talks not just about this commonality and how much she enjoyed his friendship. She talks about how engaging with him substantively actually helped her be a better justice. And what I mean by that is that she said, for example, in her opinion for the court in VMI, which was a case involving the question whether the Virginia Military Institute should open up its admissions to female cadets. And she wrote for the Supreme Court saying, yes, the Constitution requires this. The state cannot create a far inferior female military academy. They have to let women into the elite, storied, prestigious VMI. She did so writing for a court of 7 over his single dissent. Justice Scalia was the only dissenter. And at his memorial service, she talked about that dissent, which, if anyone has read it, they know is really biting. He is angry in his dissent. But she says she's grateful for that dissent because he gave her an early version of the draft. And it enabled her to go back and think more fully through her own arguments. It enabled her to make her opinion and her view much stronger because she was able to address the best arguments on the other side and, in her view, explain convincingly why they were misguided. And she said with every iteration of her draft responding to every new version of his draft, her opinion got better and better. And I like to tell that story to my students because I think it's a really important story, particularly for lawyers, although obviously the lesson transcends the law. But for lawyers, to be a successful lawyer, you need to understand the other side and you need to be able to engage with it. And so I think that was an important component to their friendship as well. And again, though, it was all based on this mutual respect and this common ground that they had charted.
It's probably a particularly important message in today's world, I think. You know, it's interesting the way you have laid out the book. Even though I knew the ending as a lawyer, I knew what the cases were going to be. It really provides a window into dramatic changes in the law that impacts us the laws that impact us every single day, from the first case that you talked about that she and Marty did to even her dissent. When you talk about her dissent in the Lilly Ledbetter versus the Goodyear case, where she says, okay, it's now up to Congress to make equal pay and to provide Lilly Ledbetter the redress that she deserves. And in fact, she's on the US Supreme Court, but Congress acts immediately to address what she has said in a dissenting opinion. So how do you see this evolution of her life, whether as an advocate or as a jurist, impacting everyday life in America today?
I think her impact was tremendous. I mean, if you look at the state of the law in the 1960s, you have a Supreme Court opinion in 1961 in a case called Hoyt versus Florida that says it is okay for states to exclude women from the jury rolls. And, you know, as she talked about it, she says that conveys something, that we don't value women's civic participation. By the end of the 1970s, she had gotten the Supreme Court for the first time to recognize that the Equal Protection Clause has something to say about distinctions drawn on the basis of gender, and in fact renders most of them inherently suspect. And she had secured one victory after another that had really dramatically changed the landscape for women and men. And this is an important point I meant to make earlier. She, in Charles Moritz, and in other cases, like the case of Stephen Weisenfeld, a case of a widowed father who couldn't collect Social Security benefits that his wife would have collected had he passed away. In those cases, she was able to present to an all-male Supreme Court, know your audience, right? That discrimination actually runs in many directions. And so it's not just that women were being held back, but men were being held back as well. And they were being held back from doing things they wanted to do, like take care of their mother or take care of a son in the wake of the loss of a wife. And that was her vision for equality, that you would have equal parenting, you would have equal opportunity, so that each individual could chart their own course, chart their own destiny. And I like to say, because I really believe it, that if she had never sat on the Supreme Court, I think you and I would be sitting here talking about her in some capacity because of all that she accomplished just in the 1970s. But speaking more broadly to her legacy as a justice, I think she carried that vision for the Constitution, that this idea that it is supposed to be a vehicle for opening up opportunity for everyone. She very much carried that into her time on the bench. And you see it come through in the decisions like Ledbetter, where she says, we have the majority, all male, interestingly, majority in that case makes it very hard to bring long-term pay discrimination claims by saying that we should read the statute very narrowly. If you've been paid in a discriminatory fashion over a long period of time, each of those paychecks is a discrete episode of discrimination, and there are time limits on when you can complain about that. So in dissent, she says, that makes no sense. You don't understand how the law works in the real world, and you don't understand that discrimination is cumulative. And you also don't understand that the first woman is not going to run forward and scream and complain when she's the only woman in the workplace, because she's going to be labeled a troublemaker. So we need to think about how the law, again, opens up opportunities for equality. And that's the overarching idea there. The other thing that you hinted at, and I think is really important, is that she didn't just think that was a job for the courts, and she always thought that the courts should be in a dialogue with the legislatures, as well as the people. But Ledbetter is a great example, because as you note at the end of her dissent, she says, okay, my colleagues have gotten this one wrong, but this is an interpretation of Title VII, a statute that is subject to the control of Congress. So if Congress wants to fix the error of their ways, Congress can. And that's exactly what Congress does. And interestingly, going back to our discussion of pregnancy discrimination, this is something that she had drawn on from her time in the 70s, because in the 70s, the Supreme Court twice had held, first as a constitutional matter, and then under Title VII, that pregnancy discrimination is not gender discrimination. And she and a fellow colleague at the ACLU wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in which they said, this is in the 70s, Congress can fix this. Congress can amend Title VII and say pregnancy discrimination is gender discrimination. And lo and behold, Congress did that. It passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. So this is a lot, all of these things that she did as a justice were built on a long-term vision of how the law should work as a force for opening up opportunity.
I know her work as a lawyer is amazing, but you tell incredible stories about her personal life and the amazing partnership and marriage that she had with Marty, where they literally followed each other kind of around the world. They decided to go to the same, they were going to go to the same postgraduate education. They were going to choose that together. Then she followed him to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Then they moved to Harvard. Tell us, I mean, I know he was known as the chef supreme, because she said she learned early on that she was a pretty lousy cook. He took that over. I think there's even a cookbook with his recipes in it. But tell us your view of that beautiful partnership that is often so rarely seen.
You know, I try to convey this in the book, but one of the very best parts of clerking for her when I did, while Marty was still alive, was having a front row seat to that extraordinary marriage. It was a love affair for the ages. They were so devoted to one another, and it was hard not to revel in it. It was just beautiful. And I think we talked at the beginning about her perseverance and her resilience and her determination. And as I said, I think that's a very big part of the explanation for how she was able to do so much and contribute so much. But if she were here, she would say the other part of that is Marty. Marty was her partner in the truest sense of the word. From the beginning, he was incredibly supportive of her career, and he recognized that she had exceptional talents and the ability to make a contribution, a significant contribution. And so he full stop supported all of that. And, when you look back and the time periods we're talking about, he was very much a man ahead of his time, but he appreciated her talents. And like his wife, he did not carry a big ego. Um, was very comfortable in his own skin. He was enormously accomplished. He was probably one of, if not the best tax lawyer of his generation. And so, he wasn't threatened by his wife. He was fully supportive. They were two extraordinary human beings. And watching them it was a joy. So, he cooked for her. He doted on her. The year I clerked for her was the first time she had cancer. He used to come to chambers and he would sit in her office and kind of give her a hard time until she would finally agree to come home, because she was so hardworking, but he knew she needed her rest. She was in treatment and she needed her recovery. He would make special meals for her that year to help her keep her weight up. He was an extraordinary chef. There is a cookbook of all of his recipes called Chef Supreme. I commend it to all of you. I remember, to that point, in the larger point of devotion, he and the justice came to dinner at our home once, a couple of years after. They came many times, but the first time they came, shortly after my clerkship, I remember he showed up with 2 baguettes under his arm. I said, "Who brings bread to a dinner party?" And he said, "Oh, there isn't a bakery in town that can make a decent baguette, so I make my own. I always bring them with me." And then the other thing he had a flask in his jacket pocket, and it was a flask of Campari. And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Well, nobody ever has Campari, and her drink was Campari and soda." So I've learned over the years that everywhere they went, he always brought a flask of Campari to make sure that his sweetheart could have her favorite drink. Now, I will say for the record that because I had worked under her and she had trained me always to be prepared, I had dutifully purchased a bottle of Campari for said dinner party. And it was a very proud moment for me when Marty discovered that I had it on hand and he didn't need his flask. But the larger point is that this is someone who really doted on his wife. And as you say, he was very instrumental in getting her noticed and thought about and considered by President Clinton. And she would say, as she does in the book, Marty was my biggest booster, always.
So I wish I'd known about the Campari, because I actually was honored to host a reception for her in my home while I was mayor, and I didn't know about the Campari. I had it, but I did not offer it to her. So
Shoot.
my miss on that. And I didn't see a flask in Marty's pocket either, but perhaps it was there. And I know, so that I can imagine the time she spent in Fort Sill, which is an Army facility, as an Army wife, and you said she was demoted. Did she have any other discussion about her time in Oklahoma? Obviously, being pregnant with her first child, it was a pivotal moment for their future.
Yes, and she talks about this in the book. She talks about how important it was to Marty from the beginning to be a fully present father. He had this idea that children form their very strong attachments early on, and that they also form their personalities very early on. And so they had Jane who was now a law professor at Columbia Law School. They had her while they were in Oklahoma, and she talks very fondly about how hands-on a father Marty was. And I think that is a huge component also to this love affair and this partnership that led to both of them having such full and successful careers, and also just such a happy life together. She liked to say that women will never fully make it and be equal until men step up and share in the domestic part of the equation. And she knew that from her life. And that started in Oklahoma during those very special years.
So one of the people listening at home would like to know if she, and I'm sure she did, but if she shared any instances of sexual harassment. We know she had we know she had gender discrimination based upon wages, but with the discussion today did she ever discuss any issues of sexual harassment that she experienced?
You know,
Would that
that's a great, sorry,
that would
that's
not go away?
that's a great question. I don't recall, I don't recall specific discussions with her myself. I would have to guess she's probably spoken about this publicly, but I haven't seen it. She has, you know, to your question, she's spoken a great deal over the years, had spoken a great deal over the years, and talks about this a lot in the book. Just so many instances of facing discrimination, whether it's lesser pay, hiding her second pregnancy until she gets her contract to
That's a
be,
great story in the book.
yeah, I mean, that's incredible. She was untenured. I mean, to wrap my head around this, when I was untenured and got pregnant, I had to negotiate what the terms of any maternity leave would be. This is decades earlier. She's navigating all of this in the 60s. And, you know, of course there's no maternity leave policy, and she's on a year-to-year contract without tenure, and she gets pregnant. She hides it by wearing oversized clothes until she gets that next year's contract. And then she says, oh, hi, by the way, I'm pregnant, and we're going to expand our family. But, you know, so there are so many stories like that. She never talked to me about harassment, but I can't believe that she didn't experience it. I mean, I think we all have. So I would be shocked that she hadn't. She certainly was very sensitive to the issue and cared very passionately about it, and understood that this was one of many ways in which women experienced discrimination and were held back in the workplace and elsewhere.
Her dry wit comes across in the book, I think, very well. And when she talks about some of the best advice she received was from her mother-in-law on her wedding day. And her mother-in-law, I think, said to her, the secret to a successful marriage is to be a little hard of hearing all the time, or some of the time. And she said she took that advice and used it at work as well. When someone would say something that was critical or mean, she would just let it pass by. So I imagine you clerked for her in 2009, 2000, is that?
1999 to 2000, so the year before Bush versus Gore.
That's right. Okay. So, so I can imagine during that time, as well as when you all were spending time putting together this book, as her cancer had reoccurred, that she gave you some great advice. So will you share with us some of the advice that she shared with you?
So much advice. So many words of wisdom over the years. It's hard to know where to begin, but I do have a couple of things I will share. But before I do that, I will say, I think the best thing that she did over the years was model how to be a good person, how to be a kind person, how to lift up others, how to live a rich and full life, and how to choose a partner. That was very influential on me. I met my husband after clerking for her, and I had very much the hope of finding a partnership like hers in mind when I met him. There are two instances that stand out where, among many others, she gave really helpful advice and encouragement. So the first was a few years after I clerked for her. I went through my family went through a very difficult period, and without getting too specific, I'll say it was something with which she had experience, and she found out and wrote me a letter and said, you can't see it now because you're in the thick of it, but I'm going to tell you from my vantage, where I'm sitting, you will look back on this experience and you will find many silver linings and many blessings that you can't see right now. And that was an overture that in the moment really meant the world to me, because it helped carry me through a very difficult period. And I could actually see in real time the wisdom of what she was saying and come to appreciate that there would be many blessings that would come out of it. And she, of course, was right. The other I don't know if this is a piece of advice. I think it's a piece of advice story that I have that I love is when I went back to work after having my first child. I remember I wrote her an email and I said, oh gosh, I'm so nervous about this. I'm going back to work. And, everybody talks about work-life balance, especially in the legal profession. It didn't really matter to me in a consequential sense until there was this baby at home. And I was really nervous about how I was going to pull this off. And I expressed my nervousness to her and my anxiety. And she wrote back a one-line email. And all it said was, where there's a will, there's a way. And that was her way of sharing her own experience, sharing her own wisdom, kind of nudging me along a little bit, right? Like, you can do this, being encouraging, but also kind of, don't doubt yourself, get in the trenches and do the work. You can do it. And I've carried that with me through so many experiences. And I think it is a window into who she was. And again, that determination, where there's a will, there's a way. And on her account, on her score, there was a will to contribute. There was a will to serve, and nothing was going to get in her way.
Seems like a true philosophy of her life.
Yes, absolutely. I think so.
So I know the base of the book was really her coming to Berkeley and honoring one of her friends who was a fellow law professor who was writing a book about some of the first female law professors. But talk to us about the process of putting this book together with the amazing justice, and then as she had her recurrence of cancer when you were completing the book.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say there. I'm so thrilled that you mentioned she came to Berkeley to honor Herma Hill Kay, who had been her friend for many decades. Together, she and Herma Hill Kay had written with a third co-author, Kenneth Davidson, the very first casebook on sex discrimination in the law. So this is in the early 1970s, and this is effectively founding this field that then she blows wide open through her advocacy before the Supreme Court. And Herma passed away in 2017. And at Berkeley Law, we created a memorial lecture series, and we wanted Justice Ginsburg to come and give the very first lecture. Herma had been the second woman on our faculty and our first woman law dean, and was a huge deal in her own right. So to our great delight, Justice Ginsburg agreed to come and give the lecture, although she said, let's make it a conversation. And that's the genesis of the book. We planned this conversation and had a lengthy back and forth about what we would cover and what we thought would be fun and what we thought would be interesting, and whether there was some new ground that we could cover in our interview, especially since along the way we decided to turn it into a book. And one of the reasons we did that was, one, we thought it would be fun, but two, we knew that Herma's final work, which is a book chronicling the stories of the very first American women law professors, a book called Paving the Way, we knew that that book had languished. No publisher had agreed to publish it. The justice had written the introduction to it, telling Herma's story, which Herma had told all the stories of the women before her and then stopped, of course, at herself. So the justice filled that void. And we knew that the University of California Press was considering publishing that book that Justice Ginsburg so very much wanted to see published. So we had the idea that it would be fun for us to do this project together, and that we could use it as a carrot, offering it to UC Press to get them perhaps to publish both books. And to our great delight, they jumped at the idea, and both books are over my shoulder, having just released alongside one another. I'm very, very proud of that. The justice wanted this so very much. And one of the last things she said to me about our book was, make sure you always talk about Herma's book too. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I see her book behind you.
Yeah, they're both there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. She, working with her, it was so special. It had been 20 years since I'd been her law clerk. And there are so many things I can say. It was just so incredible to be able to say to her, I called her boss, or I called her justice, boss, what are your favorite opinions? You've written over 1,000 opinions. Which ones are they? And to talk, have this back and forth with her about which ones they would be and why. And to talk with her about what were your favorite cases when you were arguing in the 70s before the Supreme Court. That was really special. I just cherish those conversations. And the other thing is, she hadn't missed a beat. So I would send her pages, and there were a lot of flashbacks to my clerkship, because when I clerked for her, as I mentioned, she had cancer for the first time. And there were a lot of days when she was in the hospital, and she would call us and she'd say, send me work. You're not sending enough work. You're holding work back. And she'd get very upset. And so we would put these packets together and send them to her, and everything would come back all marked up. And this past summer, a lot of times she was in the hospital, and she would say, why aren't you sending me pages? Send me pages, send me work. I want to work. And so it was that same mindset of just keep doing the work, keep doing the work. And so I would send her pages, and lo and behold, they would come back completely marked up with edits, just like when I was her law clerk. And that's a little embarrassing, because it shows that maybe I haven't made as much progress in my writing skills as I thought. But what I love about that is it shows that she was still so rigorous, so meticulous in editing my work. And she even edited my cover emails that her assistants had printed out for her, which is really, really embarrassing to admit, but also kind of funny. And, we all need to poke fun at ourselves. So I'll do it a little bit here. But it just shows the care and the attention to detail that was still very much there. We had so many special conversations, and she was in a very reflective mood when we were talking about it. I remember talking to her about, for example, how Justice O'Connor had, you talked about how she liked to give credit to other people. Justice O'Connor had been offered the majority opinion in the VMI case. And Justice O'Connor said, no, Justice Ginsburg should have this because of all of her work as an advocate. It would be really special for her to have that. And Justice Ginsburg was so grateful for that. And I remember talking to her about it, and she said, I think about Justice O'Connor like a big sister. She was my big sister. And what a special memory for her to share, and to be able to have that conversation with her. And so, it was all just very special. And in our last conversation, we talked about my kids. She asked about my kids, and she asked whether they were going to be going back to school because of the pandemic, whether they would be online or in person. And then she asked about all kids. She said, well, she didn't ask, she said she was really worried about all the children in the world that were being so profoundly affected by the pandemic, and how it was likely to hold many of them back. She was so concerned about that. And, that was one of the last things she said to me. And I remember that. And I've held that very close, because here she is struggling, really intensively struggling medically. And she's thinking about other people. And more specifically, she's thinking about kids. She's thinking about the next generation. And that's who she was. She was a very forward-thinking person. And she was always ferociously optimistic about all that we could accomplish. And so I hold on to that when I think about her, and I hope others will too. I hope they will remember that this is someone who was always forward looking and asking, what can we do to build a more perfect union, to make things better, to open up opportunities? And our great hope for this book was that people would pick it up and they would be inspired by her example to keep doing that work.
I have been inspired. The book has inspired me, I can say. Tulsa, as you may know, is facing, coming upon the centennial of one of the worst race massacres in our country's history.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to think about how Justice Ginsburg would have us approach and work to the next level for that race massacre. We wish we had her words of wisdom here.
I can't speak for her, but I can speculate what some of the things would be that she might say. We have a passage in the book, and it was originally supposed to be the final component to the book. It's a speech she gives at a naturalization ceremony, and it was supposed to be the final component. I've added an afterword after she passed, but she talks in there about de Tocqueville, and I think it's something that would be very timely to think about as we approach this very important anniversary of a horrible massacre. She talks about how de Tocqueville said that the genius of America and the greatness of America is not that we are more enlightened. It's that we are able to look at our faults and really think hard about them, and then ask ourselves, what can we do to address them? And I think that is a very timely lesson as we think about not just the the events in Tulsa a century ago, but everything that is going on in this country. She was one that was off to say, you know, we can't hide from our problems. We've got to face them. We've got to address our shortfalls, and we've got to do the work to make things better. And she talked a lot about this in the context of race. So in her opinion in Grutter, an affirmative action case, she talked about how race discrimination, you know, blatant race discrimination, and this is in 2003, is still a huge component of the American experience. Also, unconscious bias is, but you know, she said there, and she said in other places, there's still a lot of work to do. She had an opinion only a couple of years ago in a case called Westby, where she said, you know, we need to really think hard about police accountability and how the law holds police accountable when they cross the line. And so, you know, the law and all that we are doing, it's an ongoing conversation where we have to address our faults, and we have to talk about the past in order to build a better future. So again, I don't want to speak for her, but if I had to guess, I think that she would say something to that effect.
And it does seem like that is another theme that Justice Ginsburg and that you put together in the book, and that is the theme of building a more perfect union. That it is an evolving process that we each need to work on every day. That's what you view as her philosophy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the title is no accident. When you look over the course of her writings, her Senate testimony at her confirmation hearings, her speeches, her opinions, her advocacy, you keep seeing reference to the preamble of the Constitution, which calls on all of us to build that more perfect union. I think that was a big theme for her. You know, it was a governing principle, but it was also something to which she kept referring back throughout all of those years. And so, you know, we chose it for the title because hers was a life working toward a more perfect union. But we also, you know, if you open the book and you look at the dedication, and we had a long back and forth about this, we dedicated it to our families, but we also dedicated it very consciously to all those who work to make ours a more perfect union. And the idea again was to inspire people to invest in this work because it's so important. And it's so important that a broad swath of us all engage in this work.
Well, I think the release of this book at this time, both so near her passing, but also at this time in American history, is so important. It is, as I said to you, I read it twice. I have it marked passages that I'm going back to be inspired. I would encourage others to do it. It is in a way uplifting, because you do see the progress that she made in her life with many roadblocks in her way. So Amanda, I want to thank you for being with us today and for sharing her spirit. I think you write beautifully. I have a tendency to correct people's writing, and I wouldn't have corrected yours at all. It's beautiful, beautiful, inspiring. One of those books that you almost don't want it to end. You almost don't want to be at the last page, because it really gives you a positive view of what the world can be. And so I hope we can all take that spirit that you've given us with Justice Ginsburg, and we can take it into our hearts and move forward with it each day. So I thank you for joining us. And would you like to make any closing remarks?
I want to say thank you so much. I've so enjoyed being in conversation with you and all of your hospitality. And it's just really, you know, it's very bittersweet to be releasing a book with a co-author who's not with us anymore. And if I say much more about that, I'll get quite emotional. But I love that through this book, we are talking about her, we are keeping her legacy alive. And hopefully, you know, as you said, I really hope that it does inspire people, that people pick it up and they walk away feeling uplifted, because her story, it is an uplifting story. It's a story that we want, and I certainly want people to be inspired by. And so I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about her, and thank you.
Thank you for your time in writing the book and for sharing your time with us. Everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next Magic City Book event.
Thank you.